Hello, and welcome to Say That Again Slowly, the Cambridge Festival podcast, where students at Cambridge University chat with experts who have contributed to the festival. We try to pair up students with researchers and authors from very different disciplines to bring things back to basics. So, there are no stupid questions here. My name is Gaia Dratwinska, and I'm a first year undergraduate student studying English. Today, I'll be interviewing Nicholas Ong, who is doing a talk called A Lecture Recital, celebrating the life and work of Russian composer Valentina Serova, 1846 to 1924, which will take place at 3 p.m. on 23rd of March. So, welcome, Nicholas. To begin with, can you please introduce yourself?
Hello, Gaia. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Nick. I'm a second year PhD student in the Faculty of Music, where my research focuses on women in music in 19th century Russia, and more specifically on Valentina Serova, as we all learned very quickly in this podcast.
Yeah, so could you tell us a bit about your talk?
Yeah, so my talk is basically what is basically the result of my PhD, some of the findings that I've been able to get out of doing however many years, well, a year and a half of research now. It will touch on some of my research questions, including like what was the situation like for women getting involved in music in the 19th century, and also historiographical issues like how are we remembering or forgetting these women both in Russia and outside of Russia. And there will also be a sort of a premiere, I guess, or a second premiere of her music, which is from her first opera, Audio Acosta, composed or first premiere in 1885 in Russia, but I don't think has ever been performed outside of the now no longer existent Russian Empire. Um, I will say though it is not a full orchestral version. It is a reduced version to just vocals and piano because that is the only published version that survives. I haven't been able to source the full manuscript of the opera, and it is quite likely that it has not survived, like with many compositions by women, regardless of country, from this period.
Right. So, who exactly is Valentina Serova?
So she is, I like to call her critic composer because she was very, she contributed a lot to music criticism or writings on music on in this period, as especially as a woman, which is quite an anomaly. And she didn't publish with a pseudonym either. She published with her own name. Um, and in Russia, it was very evident that it was a female writer because Russian female surnames end with R rather than a consonant. So there was sort of a hint of, I guess, self-determination and boldness, to be willing to publish as a woman um, in in a male-dominated field. But also she wrote several pieces of music, five operas, in
Mhm.
fact. Not all of them performed, not all of them properly published, but nevertheless had made attempts to write grand works such as operas. Um, she is probably most, I guess, known to at least Russian scholars as the wife and mother of Alexander Serov, the critic composer, and Valentin Serov, the famous portrait painter. I think arguably Valentin's fame actually trumps that of his parents, but he worked in the field of art rather than music.
Mhm.
A lot of her work actually coincides with Alexander Serov's, and it could be argued that she modeled her career after him as well. They both wrote criticism. They started a journal together, which only lasted for a year. Nevertheless, she did sort of start a project with him, and they wrote operas. Or rather, they both wrote opera was sort of their main medium for composition, which actually is also the sort of main medium for music in this period in Russia, um, particularly because opera was seen as the most direct way of communicating ideas of nationalism in music, and this was the period where Russia was trying to define itself musically after several. I mean, the 19th century was generally a period of nationalism across Europe, I guess. So Russia was no exception, and opera was the primary medium for that.
That's so interesting. So I presume the sort of lyrics and so on are in Russian as well.
Yeah,
Wow.
the text is in Russian. The opera that we will be hearing a little bit of in the talk is titled Udo Acosta, and is actually uh, based on a tragedy by a German writer called Karl Gutzkow, and it was translated and written to a libretto by the composer herself, Valentina Serova, with the help of a friend, Pavel Blaudenberg. Yeah, so Serova actually was quite well educated. She knew three languages even from when she was little, which were German, French, and Russian. So she was exposed to literatures of all sorts. And this particular tragedy was actually quite popular in this time. I think two, 3 years ago, before the premiere of Valentina Serova's version of Uriel Acosta, there was actually also another opera written based on the same play. I unfortunately can't remember by which composer, but it felt like it was quite a famous composer. They were quite famous as well, and it felt like she but it wasn't successful. So it felt like she was trying to take on that responsibility of making it onto the operatic stage and actually do it successfully.
Mhm. That's that's interesting because yeah, how was her versions kind of received at that time? And did she do what she had, do you think she did what she intended?
Well, it's hard to say whether or not she did what she intended. To be honest, this opera kind of came out of nowhere, at least to my knowledge. There's a period before the premiere of the opera and after her husband's death, or the death of Alexander Serov in 1871. So he died in 1871, and the opera premiered in 1885. So there was a period of like 14 years that it's not exactly clear where she was. She's moving. She was moving about. That's the issue. She was moving about, and it wasn't clear precisely at which point in time where she was. Um, what we know is that she went to both Paris and Germany to further her musical training, but then she also went to villages to help the um, sort of emancipated peasants with issues of like famine, etc. So she was doing a lot of Samaritan work, but also working on her musical um, improving her musical uh, proficiency. Um, yeah, so this opera just sort of came almost out of nowhere, and it's even more impressive for it to be staged at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, which was at that time arguably Russia's biggest operatic stage. Um,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
how did it? Do you have any information on how it came to
so
be formed there?
not to my knowledge at the moment. I don't really yeah, so we know that the play itself was quite popular in Russia at this time, and that's possibly a reason for setting this play to opera. Also, quite unfortunately, anti-Semitism was rife in this period, and this opera does feature predominantly Jewish characters, and not in a good light, unfortunately. So um, there's it's possible that it is basically to um, maybe show her allegiance towards whether or not she's um, anti-Semitic, which is obviously another big question, because she was actually born to Jewish parents, and
Right,
and
right.
we don't know if they converted out of convenience. I mean, obviously they didn't live in the Pale of Settlement, which is an area in Russia where Jews were meant to, or were restricted to living. And we don't know if they converted in order to live outside of the Pale of Settlement to move to Moscow. Um, um, so we don't really know actually what her religious affiliations are. And actually, reading her memoirs, I don't think they played a big role either. Her sort of beliefs, her religious beliefs. When she married Alexander Serov, for example, they had conversations about where the wedding is going to be held, who's going to officiate it. But they came to the conclusion that no, we don't. These things don't really matter to us, so we'll just do it rather informally and almost without an audience. There were probably like 2 or 3 people who were there to witness it, and that's it. They kept everything very private. So the religious aspect of their life and marriage possibly was not a crucial thing, I think. And the opera was well received in Moscow, but I think the reviews were rather mixed in its subsequent performance in Kiev in 1889 and then in St. Petersburg in 1893. In fact, in St. Petersburg, it was received rather poorly. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who was another obviously famous composer from this time who worked at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, basically commented that in her music there is nothing beautiful. That's all. And you're familiar with the damning criticism by Tchaikovsky, which basically he basically said that there are lots of clumsy harmonies, and it's sort of he characterized it as a strange phenomenon in music, which I don't think it was a very positive positive description. Yeah, so there are mixed reviews, and it's hard to tell whether or not it's because it came from anti-Semitism or misogyny, because they are sort of masked in this damning of technical details of the music rather than social political readings, I guess.
I mean, I presume because you are studying and researching her, that you do find the music to be beautiful.
Yeah, well, so this is quite an interesting thing. I have evaluated my reasons for studying Valentina Serova,
Mm.
especially because we don't actually have any recordings of her music. None of her music's recorded. None of it's probably even seen by anybody in possibly 100 years or more. So no, I'm actually not drawn to her because of her music, because I can't say anything concrete about her music at the moment. Possibly more after the event on the 23rd, because then we can actually hear it. Um, I'm actually I guess I'm drawn to her story, to her life in this period, and her personality as someone who's so bold and strong-willed. I actually stumbled upon her when I was working on my master's dissertation on which I wrote on Alexander Serov, about how philosophies penetrated his writings on music, and a lot of the literature on Alexander Serov and also Valentin Serov do have very succinct footnotes on Valentina Serova. And so it almost feels like she makes a very vague appearance every time I read about Alexander or
Mm.
um, and so I thought I want to find out more about her, and to hopefully expand all the many footnotes into a book length dissertation, I guess.
Yeah, so could you tell me more about the relationship she had, the kind of relationship with Alexander Serov and possibly Valentin Serov as well?
Mhm. Yeah, so she wasn't I guess what would be deemed then as a typical woman. She belonged to this group of collective of women, I guess. She didn't she wasn't part of a sort of physical collective, I should say. It was sort of an ideological collective where people had shared the same ideas, but they didn't necessarily meet up to talk about those ideas. They were called the nihilists, who basically wanted women's liberation, and they saw that women had a bigger role to play in society. And this was the result of the women question being broached by the intelligentsia of 19th century Russia, which is quite interesting because the intelligentsia was predominantly men as well, so they were the ones initially concerned with women's liberation, but their ideas spread throughout the empire, especially to women as well. Nikolai Chernyshevsky wrote a book, a fictional book, titled "Что делать?" or "What is to be done?" And in it there was basically a female character, Vera Pavlovna, who exemplifies these ideals, and it was clear from Serova's memoirs that she actually was familiar with this book, because she actually proposed some of the ideas about marriage that were in the book to her husband Alexander Serov. He didn't agree, but he but he made other sort of concessions to facilitate with her musical development. Yeah, I think because Serov was quite a big personality at that time in the musical world of 19th century Russia, it was very difficult, I think, to really do anything that was quite a sort of I don't know, that could be claimed to be a landmark event, because she had this what she would call a colossus to deal with in the form of Alexander Serov. Yeah, he wrote many pieces of critical writings, and they were very sharply written. He obviously and that gained him a lot of followers, but also a lot of enemies. And in her memoir, she expressed, even after his death, she would have to deal with these enemies, and possibly and possibly amongst them were Tchaikovsky and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, hence those comments. So once again, it could be a personal reason, it could be anti-Semitism, it could be misogyny. We're not really sure what's the motivation for these damning remarks. Yeah, so it was sort of good and bad. Through Alexander Serov, she was connected to many high-profile individuals, like the singer Pauline Viardot, would be well known to music scholars, and Sava Mamontov, who would be well known to Russian scholars as sort of the main financier of many imperial Russian projects. Yeah, and actually Sava Mamontov financed her third opera, which was put up in a private theater in St. Petersburg. And then she will also somehow gain a connection with Lev Tolstoy, or Leo Tolstoy, who's obviously the great Russian writer. And he also contributed a lot to doing charitable work in the villages, and was willing to support her in that side of her work as well. So yeah, good and bad. Like when he was alive, even after he was dead, she had to deal with this rather imposing and sometimes not so positive figure. But then through him, she was able to also get these connections and develop musically. She attended all the lectures that he was conducting, and yeah, they organized like salons, like musical evenings together at their apartment, where all these people, all these luminaries would attend, and they would have discussions about all sorts, not just music. So it was a rather what's the word, sort of didactic practice that they kept up with.
So you're very much painting a sort of kind of quite distinct cultural milieu surrounding Valentina Serova. But I have a question, which is that do you think her sort of work, both musically, but also in her memoirs and also her life and her philanthropy, do you think it's feminist?
Is it feminist? Interesting. I think that depends on who you ask. I get a sense for Serova herself. Um, it isn't. Um, so a lot of feminist musicians from this period, mostly not in Russia, they tend to band together in a way, and perhaps make very explicit gestures of sort of feminism in music. So they would write, well, they would basically have a collective, as in the UK. They would have a collective. They would form a collective of women musicians, um, and sometimes can be quite vocal about uh, women in music. We think of someone like Ethel Smythe in the UK. She was, being a woman at the podium conducting and writing operas. That's kind of a very feminist image. But for Valentina Serova, the group surrounding her, the people that are around her, especially like the ones I've mentioned, they were all men. Um, the thing with the feminist movement in Russia in this time was also that it was very fragmentary. It wasn't entirely coherent. There were a lot of people who were also striving for socialism, and we know that was eventually kind of achieved in 1917. But there were, because the fight for both socialism and feminism ran concurrently. Some people felt like, socialism will solve the issues of feminism. So
Mhm.
so the so
Right.
so the determination to run for feminism wasn't as strong. So and there were people who are, darting between both basically. So it's really difficult to say whether or not she was exclusively feminist, or she was, like was part of the bunch who think that, socialism will resolve the issues that feminism has raised. Um, I think perhaps what with Uriel Acosta, though, there's a possible reading um, that the turmoil experienced by Acosta in the opera is what a lot of people who are in some ways oppressed might feel, particularly in relation to whether or not women should be liberated, or um, whether or not some smaller racial or national groups can be assimilated into the overarching Russian national identity. So yeah, I think there could be possible readings, but I probably would say that Valentina Serova, her work was not for feminist ends, I think,
Right. So
or at least
I
not in the
have,
typical sense, I guess.
hmm?
Not
What did I say?
explicitly,
Yes.
not in the typical sense. Yeah.
Um, so I have a final question, which is, what is the significance of Uriel Costa being performed for the first time outside of the Russian Empire, Soviet Union? And what do you th where do you think her legacy sort of shines through, both in the work of her contemporaries and beyond? The two questions, really.
Sure. So I think generally, the work that's being done on women from Eastern Europe in the 19th century is progressing rather slowly, which is not I mean, it's not unexpected, to be honest. A lot of I guess it gets harder when you go further back in time. There is quite a lot of work on the 20th century on women, especially because there are many prominent female creatives from the 20th century in Eastern Europe. And with the 19th century, I think with the 19th century, it's I guess perhaps better documented in the West. So female figures of the 19th century from Western Europe are currently, well researched, and possibly even their works are possibly even making into or having a rather prominent place in on concert programs. So to have her work performed, I think will, I guess, open up this or rather encourage more people to be more interested in women and music from the 19th century from this period, from this area. In terms of her influence or how her work is perhaps evident in others, that's quite a difficult question. I can't say that I feel or I'm able to perceive any influence in her I guess successors in some way. A lot of the writings on her seem to make as big of a deal of her charitable work and her opera. So yeah, in some ways that's not really sort of a musical thing. Perhaps it does something for women's liberation, but unfortunately musically I can't say for certain that there are influences on others. But obviously that doesn't undermine her work. It doesn't.
No, but thank you so much. So please do come along to Nicholas's talk, which will be at Clare College Chapel at 3 p.m. on Saturday, 23rd of March. And make sure to follow the Cambridge Festival, Facebook, X, and Instagram for more fascinating events.